Al Capone Alphonse Gabriel Capone, more commonly known as Al Capone, emerged from the gritty underbelly of early 20th century America to become a symbol of organized crime during the Prohibition era. Born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents, Capone grew up in a neighborhood teeming with gang activity and ethnic tensions. As a child, he showed both promise and a rebellious streak, eventually dropping out of school in the 6th grade after assaulting a teacher. His early brush with authority set the tone for a life that would oscillate between the shadows of illegality and the spotlight of infamy. In his teenage years, Capone became involved with small-time gangs, finding his way into the 5 Points gang under Johnny Torrio, who would later become a critical figure in Capone's rise to power. His move to Chicago in the early 1920s marked a turning point, placing him at the epicenter of a city that would become synonymous with gangsterism and corruption. Torrio, impressed by Capone's cunning and ruthlessness, eventually handed over the reins of his criminal empire to the young protege, after a failed assassination attempt forced Torrio into retirement. Capone's reign coincided with Prohibition, a time when the federal government banned the sale of alcohol, creating a fertile black market that Capone would dominate with uncanny efficiency. Capone's operations stretched across Chicago, controlling speakeasies, distilleries, breweries, and distribution routes with the precision of a military campaign. His empire, estimated to have brought in over $100 million annually at its peak, was protected by a combination of bribery, intimidation, and violence. He maintained an aura of invincibility, often evading legal consequences, thanks to widespread corruption within the police and judicial systems. Despite his illicit activities, Capone cultivated a Robin Hood-like public image, donating to charities and operating soup kitchens during the Great Depression. This dichotomy, ruthless enforcer and generous benefactor, helped cement his legacy in the public imagination. Capone's influence extended beyond business and into politics, where he wielded power over city officials and law enforcement, ensuring his criminal enterprises continued largely unchecked. His control was so pervasive that ordinary citizens often viewed him as more effective than the actual government in maintaining order and economic flow. Yet behind the charisma and the press-friendly persona lay a man unafraid to use violence to secure and maintain power. He was allegedly involved in numerous killings and orchestrated one of the most notorious acts of gangland violence in American history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14, 1929, 7 members of a rival gang led by George Bugs Moran were lined up and executed in a Northside Chicago garage, a brutal demonstration of Capone's willingness to eliminate threats without remorse. Though he was never formally charged for the massacre, the public outrage further tarnished his image and intensified federal efforts to bring him down. Ironically, it was not murder, extortion, or bootlegging that led to Capone's downfall: tax evasion. The federal government, recognizing the difficulty of prosecuting his more obvious crimes, pursued a case based on financial records and unreported income. In 1931, Capone was convicted of 5 counts of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, a landmark victory for law enforcement at the time. His incarceration began at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, where he initially received special privileges thanks to his influence and bribes. However, as stories of his continued manipulation surfaced, he was transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1934, a facility designed to house the most incorrigible criminals. Life on Alcatraz was a sharp departure from Capone's former luxury. Isolated from his associates and denied the comforts he had come to expect, Capone began to deteriorate mentally and physically. Years of untreated syphilis, contracted in his youth, began to ravage his nervous system, leading to confusion, erratic behavior, and a significant decline in cognitive function. His health steadily worsened, and in 1939, after serving about 7 years, Capone was released from prison due to his deteriorating condition. He spent his remaining years in relative seclusion at his Florida estate in Palm Island, far removed from the criminal world he once ruled. Once feared and revered, Capone had become a shell of his former self, reportedly possessing the mental capacity of a 12-year-old by the time of his death. He rarely engaged in public life, largely hidden from view as he battled the consequences of his illness. Family members and a few close associates provided round-the-clock care as his physical and mental state continued to decline. Despite several attempts at medical intervention, the damage to his brain was irreversible, rendering him incapable of coherent conversation or complex thought. On January 25, 1947, Capone died from cardiac arrest following a stroke and pneumonia, marking the end of a life that had profoundly shaped American criminal history. He was 48 years old. His funeral was a relatively subdued affair compared to his flamboyant life, attended mainly by family and a few remaining allies. Though he had long since retreated from the public eye, news of his death captivated the nation, rekindling both fascination and revulsion. His legacy remains controversial, viewed by some as a cunning entrepreneur who exploited a broken system, and by others as a brutal criminal whose actions left a trail of violence and corruption. In the decades since his death, Capone has been immortalized in films, books, and popular culture, often depicted with a mix of glamour and menace. While many fictionalized accounts romanticize his exploits, historians continue to emphasize the destructive consequences of his rule. The Capone era underscored the failures of Prohibition and the dangers of unchecked criminal enterprise in the absence of effective regulation and enforcement. His story serves as both a cautionary tale and a reflection of a uniquely turbulent chapter in American history. Despite his notoriety, Capone's life also reveals the social and economic conditions that allowed organized crime to flourish. The public's demand for alcohol during Prohibition created a massive underground economy, one that people like Capone exploited with ruthless efficiency. His success was made possible not just by violence and intimidation, but by his ability to understand the gaps in law enforcement and public policy. In many ways, Capone's rise was symptomatic of a society grappling with rapid urbanization, economic instability, and moral contradictions. The lavish parties, the open bribery, and the high-profile clashes with authorities highlighted the blurred lines between legality and illegality during that era. Though the federal government eventually succeeded in incarcerating him, the systemic issues that enabled his ascent were far from resolved. Organized crime continued to evolve, becoming more sophisticated and less overt in the years following Capone's demise. Nevertheless, his name endures as the archetype of the American gangster man who embodied the excesses, ambitions, and dangers of a lawless underworld. Capone's life journey from a Brooklyn street thug to Chicago's most powerful mob boss offers a compelling narrative of ambition, charisma, and consequence. His influence extended beyond the realm of crime, shaping how Americans view law enforcement, public morality, and the limits of governmental control. He remains one of the most iconic and enigmatic figures in criminal history, a man whose complex legacy continues to fascinate and disturb. Though the world he ruled has long since faded into history, the image of Al Capone smiling in a pinstripe suit, cigar in hand, persists as a symbol of both the allure and the peril of unchecked power. Ted Bundy Theodore Robert Bundy, infamously known as Ted Bundy, stands as one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, remembered not only for the brutality of his crimes but also for the unnerving charm and intelligence that veiled his monstrous actions. Born in Burlington, Vermont, in 1946, Bundy's early life was marked by a deceptive calm. Raised believing his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister, the foundational years of his upbringing were riddled with confusion and emotional instability. This unconventional and misleading family structure may have played a role in the psychological fractures that would later surface. As he matured, Bundy exhibited signs of social awkwardness, but also demonstrated notable academic aptitude and a keen ability to manipulate those around him. He studied psychology at the University of Washington, where he was described as articulate and charismatic. It was during these years that the early indicators of his double life began to emerge. On one side, he projected the image of a responsible, attractive, and ambitious young man. On the other, he developed a growing obsession with control, domination, and violence. Bundy's crimes began in the early 1970s and were spread across several states, including Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. His modus operandi typically involved luring young women with feigned injuries or requests for assistance, exploiting his clean-cut appearance to gain their trust before abducting and ultimately murdering them. These acts were not impulsive but were premeditated and calculated, often involving elements of psychological torment and physical brutality. His victims were usually brunettes with middle-part hairstyles, believed to resemble a woman from his past who had rejected him, suggesting a personal motive embedded within his larger compulsion. Bundy's ability to evade capture for years was due in part to his meticulous nature, his mobility, and his understanding of law enforcement procedures. He often revisited crime scenes, a behavior indicating a deeper and disturbing level of attachment to his acts. Despite mounting evidence, he remained a ghost to authorities for much of the early investigation, blending seamlessly into society and even assisting in political campaigns. His crimes escalated in both frequency and boldness, culminating in a series of horrific assaults at a Florida sorority house, where he attacked multiple women in a single night, leaving a trail of devastation and fear. Bundy's arrest in 1975 marked the beginning of a long and dramatic journey through the American judicial system. Initially detained on suspicion of burglary, his involvement in far graver crimes soon came to light. He escaped custody twice, once leaping from a courthouse window, and another time crawling through a hole in the ceiling of his cell. Both escapes highlighting not only his desperation, but his relentless cunning. His second escape led to a killing spree in Florida, reinforcing the danger he posed and prompting a nationwide manhunt. Eventually, Bundy was recaptured and stood trial in one of the most highly publicized court cases in American history. The trial, held in Miami in 1979, was the first of its kind to be televised nationally, turning the courtroom into a spectacle and Bundy into a morbid celebrity. Acting as his own attorney, he cross-examined witnesses and played to the cameras, displaying a chilling self-confidence and lack of remorse. The courtroom was frequently filled with spectators, many of them young women strangely drawn to the spectacle of a handsome man accused of unthinkable crimes. Despite his efforts to manipulate proceedings, the overwhelming evidence presented by prosecutors led to Bundy's conviction. He was found guilty of multiple counts of murder, including the particularly brutal slayings at the sorority house, and was sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, Bundy attempted to delay his fate by offering confessions and insights into his crimes in exchange for extensions. These last-minute revelations were often strategically timed, designed to grant him a few more days or weeks of life. Over time, Bundy began to admit responsibility for a larger number of murders, with his final tally believed to exceed 30 victims, though the actual number remains uncertain. His confessions revealed not just the breadth of his crimes, but the cold, calculated nature behind them. He spoke in detached, analytical terms, rarely showing genuine emotion or empathy. Psychologists and criminologists who studied Bundy have described him as a textbook example of antisocial personality disorder, marked by superficial charm, manipulativeness, and a profound lack of conscience. His case has since been used in academic and law enforcement training programs to illustrate the deceptive appearance of sociopathic behavior. Throughout his time on death row, Bundy received thousands of letters, some from admirers and others from individuals hoping to understand his motivations. His interviews became a subject of national discourse, dissected by scholars, journalists, and the public alike. Bundy used his remaining years to speak about pornography and its alleged influence on his actions, a claim that many viewed as an attempt to deflect personal responsibility. He also fathered a child with his wife Carol Ann Boone, whom he had married in court during his trial, a move that further complicated public perceptions of his character. As the years passed, efforts to delay his execution grew increasingly futile. The state of Florida, resolute in carrying out the sentence, rejected appeals and set a final date. On January 24, 1989, Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison, an event that drew cheers from crowds gathered outside the prison gates. People held signs, set off fireworks, and celebrated the end of a man whose actions had haunted the country for over a decade. News of his death was broadcast across television and radio, marking the closure of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. The legacy of Ted Bundy continues to be a topic of discussion and analysis, not because of admiration, but due to the disturbing implications his life and crimes present about the nature of evil and the masks it can wear. His case revealed vulnerabilities within the criminal justice system, particularly in coordinating efforts across state lines and recognizing patterns in violent crimes. Bundy's capacity to operate undetected for years, despite numerous interactions with law enforcement, underscored the need for more sophisticated investigative tools and interdepartmental communication. His story also contributed to a growing cultural fascination with true crime and the psychology of killers. Inspiring books, documentaries, and dramatizations aimed at exploring the darkest corners of human behavior. For many, Bundy remains a symbol of the predator who hides in plain sight, reminding society that danger can often come disguised in familiarity and charm. His ability to deceive even the most experienced investigators challenged assumptions about what a killer looks like, forever altering the public's understanding of criminal profiles. Even in death, Bundy's name elicits a visceral reaction. His manipulation of the media, his courtroom theatrics, and his grotesque crimes combine to create a figure both reviled and studied. Families of victims have spent decades coping with the trauma he inflicted, their lives permanently marked by loss and unanswered questions, while Bundy was ultimately brought to justice. The emotional scars left behind continue to resonate with those who lived through the horror. His death provided a measure of closure, but not full healing, as the memories of his actions and the lives he destroyed cannot be undone. In recounting Bundy's life, it is essential to remember the individuals whose lives were stolen, whose voices were silenced, and whose families endured unimaginable grief. Though he often dominates the narrative, it is their stories that deserve remembrance. The fascination with his case should serve not as glorification, but as a solemn reminder of the importance of vigilance, justice, and the enduring impact of crime on society. Ted Bundy's life and eventual death form a stark, cautionary tale, portrait of how evil can wear the mask of civility and how justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, often referred to as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was one of the most unsettling and infamous serial killers in American history, whose gruesome crimes shocked the nation and left a deep scar on public consciousness. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dahmer's early life was marked by an apparent normalcy that masked a growing storm within. His father, a chemist, and his mother, who struggled with mental health issues, provided a home environment filled with tension and instability. As a child, Dahmer exhibited signs of isolation, a fascination with dead animals, and a growing detachment from those around him. These early warning signs were largely overlooked, allowing his disturbing interests to intensify over time. During his teenage years, Dahmer became increasingly withdrawn, battling feelings of confusion and alienation, which he kept buried beneath a facade of awkward normality. Despite attempts to engage in school and social life, he failed to establish meaningful relationships, eventually descending into a world governed by obsession and fantasy. After graduating from high school in 1978, Dahmer committed his first murder just weeks later. His initial victim was Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker whom Dahmer lured to his home under the pretense of companionship. What began as a seemingly benign encounter quickly turned fatal, as Dahmer struck Hicks with a dumbbell and later disposed of the body in a gruesome and calculated manner. This murder marked the beginning of a series of horrific crimes that would span over a decade. Following this killing, Dahmer enrolled at Ohio State University, but dropped out after a semester due to his deteriorating mental state and alcohol abuse. His father then encouraged him to join the army, hoping the structure would provide discipline and purpose. While stationed in Germany, Dahmer's conduct remained erratic, and he was discharged after 2 years due to poor performance. After returning to the United States, he drifted through jobs and residences, concealing a growing compulsion that would soon erupt into a spree of terrifying violence. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dahmer preyed on young men, many of whom were part of marginalized communities, and met him in bars or on the street. He would lure them to his apartment with promises of money, photographs, or companionship, only to drug and kill them in horrifying ways. His crimes included dismemberment, necrophilia, and acts of cannibalism, all conducted in secret, within the confines of his modest Milwaukee apartment. Neighbors often complained of foul odors, but their concerns went largely unaddressed by authorities, allowing Dahmer's killing spree to continue unchecked. His ability to appear harmless and unremarkable played a critical role in evading detection. Police had several interactions with Dahmer over the years, including one disturbing instance where a handcuffed, drugged victim was returned to his custody after police failed to recognize the danger. These missed opportunities underscored systemic flaws in law enforcement and sparked national outrage following Dahmer's eventual capture. Dahmer's arrest on July 22, 1991, came when one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and alert police. Authorities entered Dahmer's apartment and were met with a scene of unimaginable horror: photographs of mutilated bodies, human remains preserved in containers, and severed heads stored in the refrigerator. The evidence was overwhelming, and Dahmer was taken into custody, where he immediately confessed to his crimes in chilling detail. He admitted to the murders of 17 young men and boys, describing each act with a disturbing calmness that both horrified and baffled investigators. His lack of remorse and methodical explanations revealed a deeply disturbed individual, who had long been consumed by a desire to exert total control over his victims. The public reaction to his arrest was one of shock and disbelief, as the full extent of his atrocities became known through news reports, televised footage, and court proceedings that exposed a level of depravity previously unseen in modern American crime. Dahmer's trial began in January 1992 and was closely followed by media around the world. Though he pled guilty, the proceedings focused on the question of his sanity, whether he was mentally competent to understand the nature of his actions. His defense team argued that he suffered from severe mental illness, while the prosecution maintained that he acted with full awareness and intent. The courtroom was often packed, with families of the victims present, alongside journalists and curious onlookers. Testimony from psychologists, law enforcement, and Dahmer himself painted a portrait of a man whose fantasies had grown into deadly reality, unchecked and undeterred by any sense of empathy or humanity. In February 1992, the jury found him legally sane and responsible, sentencing him to 15 consecutive life terms, amounting to nearly 1,000 years in prison. He was incarcerated at Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he spent the remainder of his life under constant observation. During his imprisonment, Dahmer reportedly underwent a transformation, expressing remorse and turning to religion. He was baptized in prison and participated in Bible study, though many viewed these actions with skepticism, questioning their sincerity. He maintained a quiet demeanor while incarcerated and expressed a willingness to accept his punishment. Interviews conducted while he was in prison revealed a man who was both articulate and deeply troubled, capable of discussing his crimes with unsettling detachment. He became a figure of both fascination and revulsion, symbolizing the darkest aspects of human behavior. Despite his claims of repentance, the pain and trauma he inflicted continued to haunt the families of his victims, many of whom publicly rejected the notion of his rehabilitation. The debate surrounding Dahmer's motivations, mental state, and capacity for remorse remains a subject of psychological and criminological analysis to this day. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver while performing janitorial duties in a prison bathroom. Scarver, who was serving a life sentence for murder, later stated that he believed he was acting under divine instruction and claimed that Dahmer had exhibited disturbing behavior, including fashioning limbs out of prison food to taunt other inmates. The killing occurred in a relatively unmonitored area, raising questions about prison oversight and the vulnerability of high-profile inmates. Dahmer's death brought a sudden and violent end to a life marked by unspeakable horror and psychological torment. News of his murder was met with mixed reactions. Some viewed it as an act of justice, while others saw it as a failure of the prison system to protect even those who were behind bars. His body was cremated, and his ashes divided between his parents, who had long struggled with the implications of their son's actions and the torment he caused. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to evoke fear, anger, and reflection. His crimes prompted changes in police procedures, awareness of missing persons cases, and discussions about the intersection of mental illness, sexuality, and criminal behavior. He has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and dramatizations, each attempting to understand how such evil could coexist with apparent normalcy. The photographs, trial footage, and recorded interviews remain part of the public archive, serving as both a record of his deeds and a warning about the dangers of ignoring early signs of violent tendencies. For the families of the victims, Dahmer's death did not bring closure, as the memories of their lost loved ones remain a daily reality. His name has become synonymous with terror and depravity, a grim reminder of the capacity for darkness within the human mind. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not merely one of a killer, but a stark and enduring symbol of society's struggle to confront and comprehend the extremes of human behavior. John Wayne Gacy, widely known as the Killer Clown, is one of America's most horrifying serial killers. A man whose crimes not only stunned the public, but redefined the sinister capabilities hidden behind a cheerful mask. Born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, Gacy was raised in a working-class family where he endured a difficult childhood marked by a volatile relationship with his alcoholic and abusive father. Despite these early struggles, he sought validation and worked hard to gain social acceptance. He showed early signs of ambition and an eagerness to be liked, yet his home life remained emotionally damaging, contributing to his later psychological conflicts. As he grew older, Gacy became involved in various community and political activities, successfully projecting an image of a friendly, responsible citizen. He managed restaurants, joined civic organizations, and even volunteered to entertain children at hospitals and parties dressed as a clown named Pogo, earning the unsettling nickname that would forever be associated with his legacy. Behind this outward appearance of kindness and community involvement, Gacy concealed a much darker side. He had a troubled early adulthood, with legal issues emerging in the late 1960s, when he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa. This resulted in a prison sentence and the collapse of his first marriage. After serving a reduced sentence due to good behavior, Gacy returned to Illinois and began rebuilding his life. He started a successful construction business, resumed involvement in local politics, and remarried. His ability to appear rehabilitated and respectable allowed him to move through society with little suspicion, even as his criminal impulses grew stronger and more violent. In the years that followed, he began luring young men and boys to his home under the pretense of offering jobs or money, often gaining their trust before subjecting them to unspeakable brutality. Many of his victims were runaways, homeless youth, or individuals seeking employment, making them vulnerable and unlikely to be missed immediately. Gacy's method of operation was calculated and sadistic. He would often impersonate a police officer, or use his clown persona to disarm and deceive his victims. Once inside his home, he used physical restraints under the guise of party tricks, only to reveal his deadly intentions moments later. He tortured and murdered them, burying most of the bodies in the crawlspace beneath his suburban home, while others were discarded in nearby rivers. His killings spanned from 1972 to 1978, and during that time, Gacy managed to maintain a of normalcy that fooled neighbors, co-workers, and even law enforcement. The scale and concealment of his crimes were unprecedented, and although some suspicions arose, they were not thoroughly investigated until the disappearance of a teenager named Robert Piest. In December 1978, the search for Piest led police to Gacy, whose increasingly erratic behavior during questioning raised red flags and ultimately led to the issuance of a search warrant. The investigation uncovered chilling evidence, including personal items belonging to missing boys and the unmistakable stench of decay from beneath Gacy's house. Further examination of the property revealed the remains of multiple victims, and as the number of bodies grew, so did the national horror at the extent of his crimes. Gacy eventually confessed to the murders of over 30 young men and boys, detailing the gruesome acts with a disturbingly casual demeanor. His admissions included the techniques he used to subdue his victims, the psychological thrill he experienced, and the elaborate methods he employed to hide the evidence. His ability to recall details so vividly and without remorse left investigators and the public deeply disturbed. The sheer volume of lives taken, combined with his chilling composure, made his case one of the most notorious in criminal history. Gacy's trial, which began in 1980, became a landmark moment in American legal proceedings, drawing enormous public attention and sparking widespread media coverage. During the trial, Gacy pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and expert witnesses on both sides debated his mental state. The prosecution painted him as a calculating killer who was fully aware of his actions, while the defense argued that he suffered from multiple personality disorders that impaired his judgment. After weeks of testimony and the presentation of overwhelming forensic evidence, the jury found him guilty of 33 counts of murder, the highest number of confirmed killings linked to a single individual in the United States at that time. He was sentenced to death for his crimes and sent to death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. Over the next 14 years, Gacy remained incarcerated, filing numerous appeals and granting interviews that offered chilling insights into his mind. In these conversations, he often denied responsibility or shifted blame, further angering the families of his victims and deepening the public's disdain. While on death row, Gacy spent much of his time painting, creating disturbing portraits of clowns and self-images that became controversial artifacts of his infamy. Some of these paintings were later sold or exhibited, sparking debates about the ethics of profiting from the artwork of convicted killers. Gacy's notoriety grew over time, and his case became a fixture in books, documentaries, and academic studies focused on criminal psychology and the behaviors of serial offenders. His life and crimes were analyzed in detail, serving as grim material for understanding the complex interplay of charm, deceit, and violence that typified his actions. The passage of time did not lessen the impact of his crimes, and the memory of his victims remained at the forefront of discussions about justice, accountability, and the effectiveness of criminal investigations. Gacy's story highlighted flaws in law enforcement's handling of missing persons cases and prompted reforms aimed at better protecting vulnerable populations. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center after exhausting all appeals. In the hours leading up to his death, he remained largely unrepentant and defiant, offering no apology to the families of those he had murdered. His final words were reported to be a vulgar dismissal of the proceedings, a final act of contempt that contrasted sharply with the grief and solemnity felt by the victims' relatives. Witnesses to the execution included some family members who had waited nearly 2 decades for closure. The moment marked the end of a long and painful chapter in American criminal history, though the psychological and emotional scars left behind by Gacy's actions remain. The day after his execution, his body was cremated, and his remains were kept from the public to prevent the creation of any physical shrine to his legacy. His death brought a measure of resolution, though the trauma he caused continues to be studied and acknowledged. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy stands as a grim reminder of how appearances can be deceiving, and how monstrous behavior can be hidden behind the most unsuspecting faces. His crimes exposed weaknesses in societal safeguards and highlighted the importance of vigilance, community awareness, and improved investigative practices. Despite the passage of time, the case remains one of the most disturbing examples of serial murder in history, frequently cited in psychological research, law enforcement training, and media portrayals of criminal pathology. Gacy's dual life, one of community involvement and another of monstrous cruelty, challenges our understanding of evil and serves as a cautionary tale about trusting public images without deeper scrutiny. His story continues to resonate, not just for the horror it brought, but for the difficult questions it forces society to confront about human nature, justice, and the importance of remembering the victims who were denied their futures by one man's horrific actions. The killer clown is no longer alive, but the lessons drawn from his life and crimes endure as somber reflections on the darkest corners of the human psyche. Bonnie Parker, immortalized as one half of the infamous outlaw duo Bonnie and Clyde, remains a figure of intrigue and contradiction in American criminal folklore. Born on October 1, 1910, in Rowena, Texas, she grew up in a modest household, raised primarily by her mother, after the death of her father, when she was just 4 years old. From an early age, Bonnie displayed signs of intelligence, charm, and creativity, with a keen interest in poetry and literature. Her formative years were shaped by the struggles of poverty and limited opportunities, conditions that plagued many families during the post-World War I period and the onset of the Great Depression. As a teenager, she excelled in school and was known for her expressive personality, often captivating those around her with a mix of wit and melancholy. At 16, she married Roy Thornton, a union that quickly turned sour due to his criminal behavior and long absences. Although they separated shortly afterward, Bonnie never legally divorced him, and was still wearing his wedding ring at the time of her death. Her life took a dramatic turn in 1930 when she met Clyde Barrow, a small-time criminal with a troubled past and growing ambitions. Their connection was immediate and intense, setting the stage for a notorious partnership that would capture national attention. The bond they formed transcended typical romance, rooted instead in a shared defiance of authority and a longing for something more than the bleak circumstances into which they were born. Following Clyde's release from prison in 1932, the two embarked on a crime spree that escalated from petty thefts and burglaries to armed robberies and murder. While Bonnie's exact role in the early crimes remains unclear, it is evident that her loyalty to Clyde knew no bounds. Her commitment led her to abandon a conventional life for one of constant danger, evasion, and fleeting exhilaration. They became the nucleus of the Barrow Gang, a loosely affiliated group of criminals who roamed across several states, eluding capture through a combination of planning, luck, and sheer desperation. Bonnie's involvement in the gang's activities has been debated for decades, with some viewing her as a hardened accomplice, and others as a reluctant participant swept up in the momentum of Clyde's violent crusade against law enforcement and the economic system. Despite the chaos surrounding her, Bonnie maintained a sense of identity through her writing, penning poems that reflected both her inner turmoil and a romanticized view of the life she had chosen. These writings offered a rare window into her thoughts and helped humanize a figure, often reduced to sensational headlines. The gang targeted small businesses, gas stations, and banks, often striking quickly and fleeing before police could respond. Their crimes were not without cost. Numerous shootouts resulted in the deaths of law enforcement officers and civilians, further intensifying the manhunt against them. Bonnie and Clyde quickly became public enemies, with their photographs and exploits splashed across newspapers nationwide, turning them into folk anti-heroes during an era of deep social disillusionment. Their notoriety was amplified by the era's media coverage, which portrayed them alternately as glamorous rebels and cold-blooded killers. Bonnie, often shown posing with cigars and firearms, became a symbol of defiant femininity, though those images were more staged than representative of her everyday reality. The public's fascination grew, fueled by the myth of two young lovers, on the run from a corrupt system, even as their actions became increasingly violent and unpredictable. Constantly on the move, the couple rarely stayed in one place for more than a few nights, sleeping in stolen cars, abandoned farmhouses, and roadside camps. Their itinerant lifestyle placed them under tremendous physical and emotional strain, but their determination to evade justice only intensified. Bonnie suffered severe injuries in a car accident in 1933 when Clyde crashed into a ravine during a high-speed escape. The resulting burns and damage to her leg left her in constant pain, yet she continued to travel with the gang, refusing medical attention that might jeopardize their concealment. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states coordinated efforts to capture the pair, employing new investigative techniques and sharing intelligence in ways previously uncommon. Eventually, their relentless pursuers began to close in, aided by informants and increasing coordination between local and federal officers. Former Texas Ranger Frank Hammer was hired to lead a special task force dedicated to tracking them down. Hammer, along with other lawmen, studied their patterns, predicted their routes, and planned an ambush. By May 1934, the trap was set in Byingville Parish, Louisiana, where the gang planned to meet a trusted associate. As Bonnie and Clyde drove down a quiet rural road in their stolen Ford V8, law enforcement officers lay in wait, concealed by the brush with high-powered rifles and orders to shoot on sight. As the car approached, officers opened fire without warning, unleashing a hail of bullets that riddled the vehicle and left both Bonnie and Clyde dead within moments. Bonnie was just 23 years old at the time of her death. Her body, along with Clyde's, was left in the car as crowds gathered to witness the aftermath of the ambush. The scene became a macabre public spectacle as locals descended on the site, some even taking fragments of clothing and glass as gruesome souvenirs. The bullet-riddled car was towed with the bodies still inside, a grim procession that captured the morbid curiosity of a nation. The autopsy revealed the extent of their injuries. Bonnie had been shot multiple times, with bullets striking her head, chest, and limbs. Though the law had finally caught up with them, their deaths marked not the end of a crime wave, but the beginning of a legend. The funerals drew large crowds, and although Bonnie had once expressed a desire to be buried beside Clyde, their families insisted on separate burials. Over time, the legend of Bonnie Parker evolved, shaped by books, films, and songs that alternately condemned and romanticized her life. Her story has since become emblematic of a uniquely American phenomenon. The outlaw idolized not for morality, but for audacity. Her life, brief and tragic, reflected the turbulent conditions of her time period, marked by economic despair, widespread disillusionment, and a hunger for heroes who challenged the status quo. Though her actions and choices brought suffering and death to many, she remains a complex figure whose motivations cannot be reduced to simple villainy. She was a woman who, despite her talents and intellect, chose a path of rebellion and violence over conformity and survival. Her legacy endures, not because of the crimes she committed, but because of the enduring questions she leaves behind, questions about identity, loyalty, desperation, and the fine line between myth and reality. Bonnie Parker lives on in the public imagination, a symbol of youthful defiance cut down in its prime, whose life and death continue to fascinate and haunt nearly a century later.